Hi, this is Jessica Jacobs, and I'm going to show you how using a Microsoft Access database can help us detect Medicaid fraud. While many organizations have tried to detect fraud, no centralized database exists. Indeed, organizing and interpreting information is key if we're going to try to take on a project of this scale. Currently, the issue is that there's a bunch of different sources for this information. You can get Excel documents from federal sources such as CMS, as well as legal proceedings and PDF documents put out by state agencies and other organizations. Additionally, on a project of this scale, you usually have a team. For this project, this was my team, and with these people, each one had a different idea. As such, so that we're not duplicating information and for efficiency, we really needed to be able to put our information together. So what we did was we used data tables. In this, we had user information, which was individuals' email addresses, phone numbers, and affiliation, a notes section, which would be a notes table, references, including reference, source, and states, and data tables, providers, tips, audits, integrity programs, and payments. This is a graphical distribution of these tables. To avoid duplicating and entering null information, we normalized our tables. So in this, there was a reference table. This reference table is what's known as a junction table. When we have information in a database that is applicable to many records, it's put into one table and referenced using a foreign key in other tables. In this database, the most common foreign key was taken from the reference table. This is where sources were coupled with states, since each state could have many sources associated with it, and each source could have many states associated with it. This unique number was then used in the notes table and data tables to reference a particular state and source. This concept was seen again when we created the individual table. This individual ID was the foreign key for the phone, affiliation, and email and notes tables, as each individual can have multiple records in each of those tables. Finally, to avoid duplication and null entries, we utilize lookup tables in many of our data entities. As you can see, this is a payment table. This payment table has a type column. This type column is actually a reference to a lookup table. As you can see in this lookup table, durable medical equipment corresponds with the previous seen type. Here you have the type and a description of this information. That way it's not duplicated many times in the other table. Now I'm going to go over 3 use cases for this information. These use cases are going to include notes entry, team reporting, and data analysis. The first use case is entering a note. So if Matt over here has an idea and he wants to stick it in the database so everybody knows his idea, all he has to do is pull up a notes form, enter the information, indicate that he's Matthew, and the reference ID, which says this state and this particular source are the source of his information, and then it's in the database so anybody can pull it up. What if this guy wants to create a team report? Well, what he would do is he'd create a query. Queries help us translate information in databases, and then he can create a report with all of our pictures, organizations, email addresses, and phone numbers so that he can pick out the specific information he might need. Finally, what if a client calls and says, "What do you know about fraud?" Can we tell them about the database? Sure we can. In this instance, performing our analysis was almost entirely dependent on finding anomalies over time and in between states in payments of Medicaid. Since there were different ways to report different programs and different sources, putting it all together was really important to see the differences. So what we did was we can utilize queries to try to pull this information. Since a query can put out a table, these tables aren't really something you want to show everybody. As such, what you can do is you make a table query and then you can export that information to Excel. Once it's in Excel, you can use it to make a graph. As you can see, this graph makes this information much more user-friendly. Finally, Access can also be used to calculate data. Here's an example of calculating the average payment for a certain type of use. The data can then be exported to Excel and read graphically as we saw before. Now you've seen how an Access database can be utilized to store, compile, and access data. Hopefully this will help us find Medicaid fraud. Now, does anybody have any questions? Thanks.